This isn't a story about hate. It's a story about love. In the last 5 years, we've witnessed violence in Syria, South Sudan, Ukraine, Central African Republic, Yemen, and a score of other nations. A few of more than the 80 countries we've worked in, without fear or favour for more than 150 years. In that time, we've garnered 3 Nobel Peace Prizes, more than any other organisation in history. But this comes with losses. Every year we see colleagues caught up in the crossfire, sometimes killed or kidnapped. Amidst some of the harshest conflicts on earth, we assist with the basics of life: water, food, shelter. We work with communities to repair central infrastructure, like roads and water systems. We support people to support themselves through small businesses and loans. And we send war surgeons, nurses and doctors to where they're most needed.
We do get postage all over. Here in South Sudan, it's in civil war, and the systems are quite broken down, so there's not enough resources to care for the many people who are victims of violence and injuries. So ICRC work here is trying to mitigate that.
Today, 65 million people are fleeing conflict, more than any other time in history. For those on the move, we support them on the journey where we can. But for those who don't want to leave their homes, or can't, they remain stuck in besieged cities. Through preference or circumstance, the conditions they face can be dire.
لأنه لا بصوبة لا يعني حرامات لا بسفنجات يعني ما عندنا شيء يعني حوشنا.
We try to reach people stranded in conflicts and make sure they have what they need. The Red Cross and Red Crescent network spans 190 countries. Through this global reach, we help families find those they've lost in the chaos of war.
Once we realized that children had no family members with them at all, we collected all the information they could give us about their families. We used the pictures of the children, we used the names of the children and the names of their family members, and this is how we managed to locate their parents, their siblings, and their grandparents.
Again and again, we connect brothers and sisters, fathers and mothers. When the circumstances aren't so fortunate, our forensic experts work to bring closure and the opportunity for a dignified burial. We care for victims of sexual violence and work to prevent such crimes.
Les hommes réagissent en niant cette réalité. Ils disent que ce sont l'affaire des femmes. C'est pour cela que nous allons continuer en tant que volontaires à faire nos sensibilisations pour qu'un jour, toute la communauté puisse être au courant et de savoir que le viol, c'est quoi.
Throughout the world, we work to help the most vulnerable people and those who may be overlooked. We care that detainees are treated humanely, no matter what they've done, visiting 1 million detainees in almost 100 countries.
Assalamu alaikum. Sa mga tarima po namin, ma'am, 23 inmates po kami, yung iba, nagdadalawa-dalawa na lang po sila. Dito sa sahig po, ma'am, mas marami po yung...
From the diplomatic level to the front line, we remind fighters on all sides that wars have limits. Named in the Geneva Conventions as an authority on the laws of war, we work to regulate the use of weapons, the methods of warfare, and to ensure civilians are spared. No matter who they are or what side they're on, we treat the sick and wounded.
Being an organization which is very neutral and impartial, that's what we do. So it's spontaneous. You don't even have to think about it. Anybody comes with emergency, you take them in, no question.
And in the wake of war, when weapons, bombs and mines are abandoned, We clean up what we can and help those whose lives have been changed by war regain their independence.
Voilà, c'est bon, c'est bon.
Often first on the ground and the last to leave. Neutral, impartial, and independent, we are the International Committee of the Red Cross.
So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the webinar series of Humanitarian.
You are still on mute, Bismoko.
Sorry.
So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the webinar series on Humanitarian Affairs in Asia, brought to you by the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, in collaboration with Sanata Dharma University, Yogyakarta, Indonesia, and also the Jesuit Conference of Asia-Pacific. My name is Dionius Bismoko Mahamboro, from the Faculty of Theology of Sanata Dharma University, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. The second part of the webinar series will address the issue of forced displacement across Asia. While the issue of forced displacement is relatively new to ICRC, the Jesuits have long established Jesuit Refugee Service as an international NGO specifically dealing with refugees. That's why we are delighted to welcome today's speakers who are coming from both organizations, from the ICRC and from the Jesuit Refugee Service Indonesia. They will discuss the plight of people forced to flee their homes because of conflicts, including internally displaced persons, migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, highlighting the added strains caused by the current pandemic, COVID-19. So this webinar aims to understand the specific vulnerability of displaced people in different stages of their journey, and then identify the availability of legal, social, and humanitarian protection in the region, and promote cooperation among humanitarian actors, civil society, governments, and academia to better protect displaced people. So before we come into the discussion of our today's topic, I would like to invite Mr. Alexandre Faith and Father Albertus Bagus Laksana of the Society of Jesus to give opening remarks. Mr. Alexandre Faith is the head of ICRC regional delegation to Indonesia and Timor-Leste, while Father Bagus Laksana is the Dean of the Faculty of Theology of Sanata Dharma University, Yogyakarta, Indonesia. So for the first opening remarks, Mr. Alexandre Faith, please.
Just 1 second, Father Bismoko,
Yeah.
because Alex is out on the
Okay,
connection.
so I think the turn, I will take over to Father Bagus Laksana first. Please, Father Bagus.
All right, thank you very much, Father Bismoko, for a nice opening introduction. And good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to some of you in Europe, perhaps. And welcome to the second part of our webinar series on humanitarian affairs in Asia and the Pacific, which is done jointly by the ICRC and the Jesuit Universities Network in Asia and the Pacific, and hosted by us, the Faculty of Theology of Sanata Dharma University, in the city of Yogyakarta, Indonesia. And we are, as Faculty of Theology here, are very delighted to host the meeting over here on Zoom platform to see all the new faces or old faces here in the platform. Last month, as we remember, we had a very exciting and stimulating exchange and discussion on detention in Asia and the Pacific. And today we are taking up the topic on the displacement. This is a pressing issue indeed in the world today, and including in Asia. And the speakers and presenters that we are bringing to you on the platform, on the webinar this evening or this afternoon will make it clear to all of us with their expertise and experiences throughout the years. And I would add that this issue of displacement can seem formidable at times. The magnitude of the problem is sometimes beyond our reach, beyond our capacity to cope with. So we need better cooperation and collaboration. So what we are doing today, this afternoon, is just that, trying to expand our spirit of cooperation, the scope of our network, and hopefully also the creativities of our responses. In the last few days, it's interesting that I've been watching Netflix series. You might have known this series. It's taking the setting of Australia. It's called Stateless. It has different episodes, and I've been watching a few. Hasn't finished yet, but it is inspired by true story, that series, and it tells about the complex and rich human story around a detention center in Australia, where strangers, asylum seekers, refugees, but also local people meet and forge deeper and profound emotional bonds and connections, where the lives of many people intersect on different levels, including the most private personal level. What I learned from this series, among others, is that refugees and displaced people have stories. They're not just problems to solve, but they're stories to listen to. We learn many things from them, and their plight is an occasion for real and genuine human encounters. As the series tells us, in one way or another, it turns out that every one of us is in a journey of looking for home, whatever home we mean by that, different levels of having a home. But we're trying to get to that home of ours, a better place, a safer place for us to live and flourish as human persons with our communities and families. So, to a certain degree, the stories of the refugees and displaced people that we are going to talk today tell us something about this fundamental reality of being human. In this sense, we need a humanist outlook as the basis for humanitarian interventions and solution to the problem. Here in this regard, as Father Pismoko has explained earlier, the Jesuit tradition and the ICRC tradition and spirit come together nicely. That's why we have to forge this collaboration even further. In his new encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, on human fraternity, Pope Francis talks about an absence of human dignity on the borders. As we know, my brothers and sisters, in our world today, borders are increasingly occupied by refugees, by displaced peoples, by strangers, by those who are looking for their new homes, fleeing their older homes without really leaving them behind. Those who are seeking opportunities for themselves and their families. They dream of better future, and they want to create the conditions for achieving it. Thus says Pope Francis. And he continues, however, their search is oftentimes met with a xenophobic mentality as people close in on themselves and it needs to be addressed decisively. The Pope states further, no one will ever openly deny that they are human beings. Yet in practice, by our decisions and the way we treat them, we can show that we consider them less worthy, less important, less human. Pope Francis warned the Christians in particular, and I quote, "For Christians, this way of thinking and acting is unacceptable, since it sets certain political preferences above deep convictions of our faith, namely the inalienable dignity of each human person, regardless of origin, race, or religion, and the supreme law of fraternal love, thus fratelli tutti," end quote. The Pope even goes further. If the conviction that all human beings are brothers and sisters is not to remain an abstract idea, but to find concrete embodiment, then numerous related issues emerge, forcing us to see things in a new light and to develop new responses. My brothers and sisters, speakers and participants of the webinar, what we are doing today is nothing other than to deepen and expand the conversation around this topic, to reach out to wider public so that we can develop better responses. In this regard, I'm particularly happy to see that many in the audience, the participants, are young people and students who will also bring youth and creativities to the table of the conversation and to the movement as well. So I hope we can learn as well from you, young people, the students in particular, your enthusiasm and creativities as millennial generation, so to speak, in terms of developing ever new responses, new creativities on the ground, moving forward. So I would like to close my remarks by expressing my deep gratitude to our esteemed speakers today, Ms. Svetlana Yudina and Ms. Mathilde de Riet-Maten of the ICRC, Mr. Gading Gumilang Putra of the Jesuit Refugee Service Indonesia, and Father Bismoko Mahamboro, the moderator, the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Theology, Sanata Dharma University here. And also, of course, we thank the head of the ICRC Regional Delegation to Indonesia and East Timor, Mr. Alexander Faite, and Pak Eko Priyatmo as well. He is the president of Sanata Dharma University, who make our event today possible in the first place. And finally, I would like to thank the steering and organizing committees that put this event together. Mr. Dominic Earnshaw, the ICRC Regional Coordinator for Humanitarian Affairs, Dr. Budi Hernawan, Ms. Lani de la Cruz, and all our colleagues from ICRC, Mas Fikri and others, as well as Weni and Awang from our own Sanata Dharma University Faculty of Theology. So without further ado, I wish you all an enlightening webinar and stimulating conversations. Thank you all.
Thank you, Father Bagus, for your nice words. And now I would like to invite Mr. Alexander Faith, the head of the ICRC Regional Delegation to Indonesia and Timor-Leste. So please, Mr. Faith.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Father Bagus Laksanana, PhD, Dean of the Faculty of Theology of the Sanata Dharma University. Warm wishes to you, warm greetings to you. I would also like to salute the various speakers, Mr. Gading Gumilang Putra from the National Information and Advocacy Office of the Jesuit Refugee Service of Indonesia, Father Bismoko Mahamboro, and naturally our own speakers, Svetlana Yudina from the ICRC Regional Migration Advisor based in Bangkok. This is the second session already of the international webinar series of Humanitarian Affairs in Asia that has been organized jointly by the ICRC and Sanata Dharma University, and it's with Jesuit universities in Asia. This is not the first cooperation we have. This webinar series built on the existing cooperation that we had already before, and in the work of working together on dissemination of international humanitarian law and humanitarian principle. Although the ICRC is not a religious organization, we certainly recognize the important role played by religious leaders and religious institutions of all faith in promoting core humanitarian values and assisting the population through difficult times. This has been clearly shown during the COVID-19 pandemics, where people around the world have turned to their religion for solace and support. So today we are going to discuss the issue of displacement. It is a formidable challenge and humanitarian concern that we face today. The global report on internal displacement of last year has documented that 28 million new internal displacement associated with conflict but also disasters have occurred across the world in 2018. And the same report has stated that almost 10 million new displacement were recorded in East Asia and the Pacific, and just short of 4 million in South Asia in 2018. So those figures are equivalent to the population of Jakarta. So this is huge when you think about it. We, the ICRC, we work mainly with regard to situation of conflict and armed violence, which are producing a lot of these displacement naturally, and especially long-term displacement, not only in this part of the world, but worldwide. And we work everywhere with the national societies, in this part of the world, where we have a great cooperation with, for instance, the Indonesian Red Cross PMI, but also the Filipino Red Cross, just to name a few. Okay, we are happy today that the Jesuit Refugee Service will be one of the speakers today, as it is naturally one important international non-governmental organization active in this field as well. So I think without taking too much of your time, I think this series of webinars, which are fast developing considering the pandemic, is a good opportunity to sort of spread knowledge within academic circles, but also with the various stakeholders in those different issues on problematic like the one of displacement that we are touching upon today, and share experience, practice, and lessons learned between ICRC and the network of Jesuits and Jesuit universities in Asia in order to respond to humanitarian concerns in our region. So thank you very much for doing this with us, the University of Sanata Dharma. Thank you very much to all the speakers today who have accepted to join forces with us. I also take this opportunity to thank my ICRC colleagues who have organized, Svetlana, Budi, and Dominic, who are, I think, all connected at this point. And I wish you a very good seminar. I will be on and off myself. I have a program also with AHA Center this afternoon, so I'll be juggling a little bit between the two. Okay, but yeah, great topic that you are dealing with today. Back to you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Alexandre Faith. And now, as mentioned before, we will discuss displacement in Asia, and the number is still increasing and increasing. But before we get started, allow me to explain how the participants would participate in this webinar. First, the participants in the Zoom meeting room can either ask a question directly after I give permission to talk, so after the presentation, or you may ask by typing the question in the chat box, so below. And the second, the participants watching this webinar in YouTube channel can also ask a question by typing the question in the live chat box. So participants, both in the Zoom meeting and in the YouTube channel, I would like to encourage you to take part in this webinar. You may send your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will endeavor to answer each questions at the end of the presentations. Now, without further ado, allow me to introduce the first speakers, Ms. Svetlana Yudina and Ms. Matilda de Rietmaten. Svetlana Yudina joined the ICRC in 2009 as a Restoring Family Links delegate in Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo. So after working in Africa continent, she moved to Asia, where she worked as a protection delegate in Thailand and in the Philippines until 2012. And her current service is ICRC Migration Advisor in Asia. Ms. Svetlana Yudina holds a Master in Public Administration from École Nationale d'Administration, France, and a Master from Moscow State Institute of International Relations, or MGIMO University. And Ms. Yudina will be presenting with Ms. Matilda de Rietmaten. Matilda joined the ICRC in 2007 as a protection delegate in Colombia. And then she moved on to work in diverse contexts, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, Gaza, South Sudan, and Lebanon. And then after 8 years with the ICRC working mostly in protection, Matilda joined the United Nations High Commissioners for Refugees, or UNHCR, where she worked for 5 years in both Lebanon and Greece. Ms. Matilda recently returned to ICRS as the Global Advisor on Internal Displacement. She holds a Master in Violence, Conflict and Development from the School of Oriental and African Studies, or SOAS, University London. Svetlana and Matilda are going to talk about migration from humanitarian perspective. So, ladies and gentlemen, a virtual round of applause for our first speakers, Ms. Svetlana and Matilda. So over to you, Ms. Svetlana.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Just to check that everything is working. Fantastic. Yeah. Can we see the presentation?
All right.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see so many people joining this webinar. I hope you enjoy it and that you'll have a better understanding of also the ICRC work and approach in migration and in displacement. While we are waiting for the presentation, we still cannot see it, huh?
Okay.
I hope most of you have seen at the very beginning of the webinar the short video about the ICRC, so I will not talk about it at length. Fabulous. Next slide, please. But I will still mention probably what we understand when we say, I think it's not the last version of presentation, but that's okay. What we understand by the movement, because I will be referring to the movement during my presentation. So the ICRC, as you might know, is the International Committee of the Red Cross. It's an independent, neutral, impartial humanitarian organization with the mandate to assist and protect victims of armed conflict. What we call the movement is composed of the ICRC, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and the national societies, Red Cross and Red Crescent. As you know, in the countries where you live or where you work, there are national societies, meaning you know that there is a local Red Cross and Red Crescent. So all these three components, they compose what we call the movement, an international movement of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. So now I will start with the description of a migrant so that we agree what is the definition we are using in the movement for the migrant. There is no universal definition of a migrant. We use this one, that a migrant is the person who leaves or flees their habitual residence to go to new places, usually abroad, to seek opportunities for safer and better perspective. Migration can be voluntary and involuntary, but most of the times it's the combination of different factors. And we include in our description of the migrants, among others, labor migrants, stateless migrants. We include also refugees and asylum seekers, while recognizing that they are entitled to special protection under international law. Our broad description of migration is voluntary because it reflects our operational practice, and it also allows us to focus on not on the rights but on the vulnerabilities first. So it's not right-based approach but vulnerability-based approach. Next slide, please. Yes. Can you click please so that we see the text? Fabulous, thank you. So as you can see on this little image, we include in the group of vulnerable migrants, refugees and asylum seekers, and just migrants in need of humanitarian assistance and protection. And indeed, an economic migrant leaving a country in peace, for example, it can be a migrant leaving, I don't know, Senegal or Cote d'Ivoire, but then he might end up transiting through a country in conflict and end up being in an extremely vulnerable situation and face protection and other sort of issues. So just to reiterate again, the international movement of the Red Cross and Red Crescent pursues vulnerability and needs-based approach, which allows us to include a wider group of migrants in our programs. We are not, what's very important to underline, we are not encouraging or discouraging migration. This is an important point because sometimes there is a discourse about humanitarian organization encouraging migration. So this is very important, and we always underline this aspect. We are not encouraging or discouraging migration. But we are calling the states to respect the rights and the dignity of those who migrate. Next slide, please. We recognize the prerogative of the states to regulate the presence of the foreign nationals on their territory, but at the same time, we also seek to ensure that the migrants receive the protection they are entitled to under international law, and the states are respecting the principle of non-refoulement. And again, we do not encourage migration, and we're just focusing on helping the most vulnerable migrants. Our strength is that the movement is present in almost all countries in the world, so we are present along the migratory routes from the country of origin through the countries of transit to the countries of destination, which actually allows us to bridge assistance and protection gaps the migrants might be facing. Next slide, please. And currently, for the ICRC alone, around 60 delegations address migrants in their operation. When I say delegations, it means that there are offices in different countries we have. Next slide, please. You might be wondering what are the main protection issues migrants might be facing. And there are actually quite many. Migrants might become vulnerable also because they might lack official documentation, not understand the local language, local customs, and might end up transiting or trapped in countries affected by conflict or violence. For example, I was talking about a migrant leaving a peaceful country, let's say Cote d'Ivoire, and transiting through Libya, trying to go to Europe, and then ending up caught in conflict. And then in these situations, migrants might face abuse and violence en route. They also might end up in detention, where the situation It's difficult because often they don't understand the local language, they don't understand what's happening. You can imagine yourself being in a foreign country, not understanding what's happening, and ending up in detention, so sometimes even without a possibility to actually inform your family about your whereabouts. Which brings me to a disruption of family contact and disappearances of migrants. One might think, oh, well, nowadays everybody has WhatsApp, WeChat, Line, and other means of communication beyond just the phones, right? But migrants might end up losing their phones, having them confiscated during their arrest or just being stolen. And what we have discovered, especially during the migration crisis in Europe, you might remember it, it was especially big on the news a couple of years ago, that actually very often migrants are not prepared for the possibility of losing contact with their family. They believe that nowadays it's very easy to stay in touch, and they don't have a contingency plan for that. They don't know what to do and to whom to address to seek help. So what happens is that families behind stay without news about their loved ones, and migrants might also die during their journey, and then their bodies are not sometimes identified, and then the families back home are not informed. So there is the whole issue of missing migrants and the families dealing with the disappearances and uncertainty. As I was mentioning also, there is an issue of violation of the principle of non-refoulement at times, which is also a very big protection concern. And migrants might face restrictions in access to essential services. I will give you an example from COVID times, right? Because this is something which is now the most burning, I'd say. In many countries, the authorities, not the authorities, the health authorities have to report, the hospitals have to report if there is a migrant coming to seek for help and he doesn't have documentation which allows him to stay in the country, right? If he's an irregular situation. So when the migrants know that they will be reported to the authorities and might face detention or deportation, they tend not to seek help for their health concerns, which is already extremely worrisome in normal situation. But during COVID times, it's not only health risk for the migrants themselves, but it also represents the risk for the communities, because if the cases are not identified, isolated, etc., then the virus keeps being spread. So this is a big issue as well, the denial of access to essential services to migrants. Next slide, please. Okay, now I will be talking about our activities for the migrants, focusing on protection activities. We are not a migration organization, as you have seen in the movies. We are focusing on assisting and protecting victims of armed conflict and violence. But we have expertise in certain fields, like detention, for example. We've been visiting places of detention that you have seen for over 100 years already, and we extended this area of expertise to provide services to vulnerable migrants. For example, in many countries, either ourselves or we support national societies, local Red Cross or Red Crescent, to visit migrants in immigration detention, providing them with sometimes assistance. It can be hygiene items, for example. It can be, which is extremely relevant, especially during COVID times. But it can be also monitoring the conditions of their detention, or a very valuable service appreciated by all migrants and which brings a real added value, is providing the detained migrants with a service which we call restoring family links, offering them to reconnect with their loved ones, either by phone calls or by exchange of the messages. In our region, in Asia and the Pacific, we carry out such visits in immigration detention, for example, in Malaysia or in Thailand. Next slide, please. I will give more details about and some key figures about our activities for migrants a bit later during the presentation. Another activity we have in favor of migrants is also our dialogue with law enforcement agencies. We do it also for victims of armed conflict, but we extended this dialogue with law enforcement agencies for the protection issues the migrants might be facing, for example, the use of force by the border guards, or to discuss the principle of non-refoulement as well with the law enforcement agencies. Next slide, please. You remember a couple of minutes ago I mentioned that what we have seen from our experience and discussions with migrants, especially arriving in Europe, but in other contexts as well, is that very often migrants are not prepared when they leave their countries of origin. I don't want to generalize. Many people migrate, they arrive safely, and everything is fine. I'm talking about the situations when people end up in extremely vulnerable situations. So what we do together with the national societies, and you see on your screen two examples. One is from Sri Lanka. It's a leaflet prepared by Sri Lanka Red Cross, and another one is from Bangladesh. So we prepare the information booklets and leaflets, and we do the sessions with the migrants discussing, prospective migrants, discussing the simple messages they need to understand and bear in mind in order to not to lose contact with their families, not to disappear, to make sure that their kids know their address and their names in case they're separated during the transit, for example. And we also prepared some short video clips which we use on social medias also to reach out to migrants, to inform them about these important points to keep in mind while going on migration. Again, we are not discouraging or encouraging migration. We're just reminding them about some simple steps to remember. Like, for example, you can see on your screen, share the travel route or the country of destination with your family and relatives, or keep the copies of your documents in electronic version. And at this point, I will ask you to show the little video we have with the preventive messages. It's very short, but I think it illustrates and shows you the way we do it online nowadays. It's a very short video clip. You might be wondering why one needs to teach their kids their names, but we faced so many situations when the kids are separated with their parents, and when we try to assist them to find their parents and we collect the information in order to start the search for their family, the only things that they can say is that my father's name is Muhammad, and you can imagine in any country how many Muhammads you can find, right? So these are important messages to bear in mind, and also to remember that in case of the loss of the family contact, one can ask support from the local Red Cross or Red Crescent office or the ICRC delegation. Next slide, please. So as I was explaining, our Restoring Family Links activities for migrants are extremely important, and if you can click them, people will see other images in the text here. And as you can imagine, behind every migrant, dead or alive, there is a family anxious for news. And sometimes we tend to forget it, especially in the public discourse when the migrants are presented as evil, and people forget that also behind the migrants there are anxious family members. So as I was mentioning, we are providing them with the phone calls to reconnect with their family members, with the Red Cross messages as well, which are open letters, allowing people to exchange the family news. And we are actually using nowadays also online platforms. The 4 pictures you see in front are the family members of migrants looking for their relatives from Europe. You can find the site on familylinks.icrc.org, and you can actually choose the country of the origin and see how many people, migrants from your country, are looking for their relatives. Those are migrants who are actually in Europe, and they're looking for their family members somewhere, and actually sometimes back in their home countries, but sometimes they might end up also in Europe or in a different country. And we had amazing success stories, for example, of Afghan refugees, when one family member was in Greece and looking for his family in Afghanistan, and then ended up finding family in Denmark or Norway. So they are very heartwarming stories, actually. Next slide, please. We are also in connection with Restoring Family Links working on clarifying the fate of the missing and humanitarian forensics, making sure that the dead migrants are treated with dignity and everything is done in order to do the proper identification and to inform the families. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, I cannot go into details because we have time constraints as well. So a couple of figures and details about what's being done by the ICRC together with the national societies. For example, in Indonesia, together with PMI, we are supporting the PMI response in Aceh. And since the disembarkation of 2 boats this year, in August and in September, PMI has facilitated 159 phone calls, allowing the people on the boats to reconnect with their families, and provided them with video calls as well. PMI also provided psychosocial support activities and assistance, especially for, which is important, especially during COVID, is that they provided hygiene kits for the beneficiaries and the personal protective equipment for the personnel. Next slide, please. In Thailand, also during COVID times, our delegation in Bangkok provided immigration detention centers with PPE materials and with hygiene materials. And this assistance is both for the detained migrants and staff, because staff also, of course, needs to be protected from COVID during their work time. And they provided as well phone call activities, supported, paid for the calls made by the staff, and also supported the migrants with the calls our delegation colleagues. So just to give you a rough idea of the numbers, since 2017, for example, it's 3 years and a half, almost 1,500 phone calls were made by detained migrants from Thailand to their families. Next slide, please. In Malaysia, over the last 3 years and a half, almost 1,000 these open messages were exchanged, Red Cross messages were exchanged between the mostly detained migrants and their family members abroad, and more than 10,000 phone calls were made by detained migrants with the support of our staff and the National Red Crescent Society of Malaysia. Next slide, please. In Bangladesh, as well since 2017, since the beginning of the crisis, almost 10,000 referral phone calls were made by the displaced people from Rakhine State to their families anxious for news. More than 1,500 Red Cross messages were exchanged, And also, more than 2,000 tracing requests were opened by people who are searching for their relatives, who didn't know about the whereabouts of their relatives. And the National Society of Bangladesh Red Crescent, and the ICRC in Myanmar are doing tracing activities, meaning physically searching for the missing relatives of the ones who opened the tracing request. And we actually managed to find 60% of them and reconnect people. It's a very labor-intense job. It doesn't mean that we just post an announcement on Facebook. We actually go and physically look for people, including in detention. Next slide, please. So key takeaways from my presentation. Migrants, irrespective of their status and whereabouts, should be treated with dignity and have their rights to respected. The international movement of the Red Cross and Red Crescent pursues needs-based and vulnerability-based approach, irrespective of migrant situation of whereabouts. And we do not encourage or discourage migration. We recognize that states have the prerogative to regulate the presence of foreigners in their country, but we remind them that they're bound by the obligation to respect the principle of non-refoulement and other applicable legal frameworks. And a very important one, and I hope if there is only one thing that the students will remember after this presentation, maybe this one will stick, that the network of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, present in more than 190 countries in the world, can help to restore the contact between migrants and their families. So in case there is a need, you know whom to address people to and to give an advice on that one. This is a very practical part of the presentation. So thank you very much. I hope you learned something new, and I give the floor to my colleague Mathilde.
So Mathilde, please, it is your turn.
Yes, hello, sorry about that. Thank you very much, Svetlana, for the presentation, and thank you very much for giving me the floor. I also have a presentation, which you should be able to see online any minutes now.
Just for a moment.
Thank you. So I will be talking about internally displaced persons, and then in the first slide we will see how this is actually, obviously there's some similarities, but there are also some fundamental differences between internally displaced persons, refugees, and migrants. Do you see the presentation? Because I don't yet. No, okay.
I'm sorry.
Oh no, it's all right.
So?
Yeah, this is not the first slide. Exactly. Yeah, no, this one is, yes. Yes, perfect. So yes, just like Svetlana, I wanted to start a bit with the definition of what is an IDP, and one of the similarities is what was mentioned in the first presentation, is that we're talking about people who are outside of their habitual place of residence. The main definition which is used is the one that you see now on your screen, which is from the UN Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, and it is the definition that ICRC uses and refers to. I think the two things to highlight from the definition is, one, the element of coerced or involuntary movement. So this doesn't mean that there can't be some degree of choice or agency, because ultimately, often people do choose whether to stay or to leave, and they certainly choose where to flee to. But it does mean that their choice is always compelled by external circumstances, without which they probably would have not moved and they would have remained at home. So I think this idea of coerced or involuntary movement is important to highlight. And the second big point to note, and the very big difference between, again, internally displaced persons and refugees or migrants, is that these are persons who do not cross an international border. So they actually stay within the country while they flee their homes. It's also important to note that this is not a legal definition, but a descriptive notion. So unlike refugees, being an IDP is not a legal status, it's a factual situation. So legally speaking, IDPs do not have a special status under international law that grants them international protection, like is the case for refugees. IDPs are typically citizens or habitual residents of the state in whose territory they find themselves. And therefore, it's the state who has the responsibility and who is in charge of their protection and assistance. So ultimately, they should enjoy the same rights and freedoms without discrimination of anyone else in that country. Next slide, please. Can we move to the second slide? I think we maybe skipped one from before, but sorry.
Is it the right slide?
No, one backward.
Backward.
Yeah. Voilà. No, the second one, it was about the legal framework. Perfect. Yeah, I think you're right. Okay. So also just to note that there's no universal legally binding instrument that specifically addresses the plight of IDPs. Again, the guiding principles on internal displacement, they have gained a broad support from the international community, and many states have actually incorporated them into their domestic law. So many of the rules that are contained in the guiding principles are actually part and parcel of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And they do provide a rights-based guidance to states and other actors on preventing, responding, and solving internal displacement. In Africa, you may have heard of the Kampala Convention, which came into force in 2012, and which was very much inspired by these guiding principles. And it's actually the first legally binding regional instrument on the protection and assistance of IDPs. So as I was saying before, IDPs are protected by international human rights law and domestic law in all situations. And when people find themselves in conflict affected states, they're also protected by international humanitarian law. Next slide, please. Sorry. So here is to highlight that IDPs are often exposed to similar threats and share the same concerns as the rest of the civilian population. So in times of conflict, if there are landmines, if there's active conflict, this is obviously something that is felt both by IDPs and the host population in the place where they're fleeing from. They often have specific needs and protection concerns which are linked to their situation, and we'll go a little bit more into these at a later stage. And excuse me, and what's also important to keep in mind is that although we talk globally about internally displaced persons, it's also important to remember that obviously within this broader category, we do see individuals, and it's important to also look at the individual needs of internally displaced persons, as these needs and vulnerabilities can differ depending sometimes on the characteristics of each person. So whether you're a woman or a man, whether you're an elderly person, whether you're a child, whether you have a disability, whether you find yourself in a camp or in an urban area, all of these different factors can and do affect the level of vulnerability and therefore the type of assistance that you should be receiving. And next slide, please. So this is also to show a bit that people's experience of displacement changes over time, and also according to the phase of displacement. So in pre-displacement, this is obviously before people flee. Usually we can see that there's an evolving or intensifying conflict. Then during the flight, people are often at risk of family separation, as was highlighted by Svetlana in her presentation, or they may face physical threats. Newly displaced persons often lack basic necessities such as food, water, and shelter, and are in need of emergency assistance because very often they have to flee in a very short time frame and are not able to carry many of their belongings with them. Those who have been displaced for longer need healthcare, education, adequate housing, and also the means to make a living so that they can recover their independence and be self-sustainable. And finally, you have the last phase, which is the durable solutions that we categorize as a return, resettlement, or integration. And there, indeed, if people want to return, they need to be supported to be able to do so in safe and dignified conditions. And those who cannot or do not want to return, they need to have concrete alternatives, and these are usually found through integration in the place where they have moved to, or being resettled to another part of the country. Next slide, please. So just to look a little bit about the ICRC's approach to internal displacement, we do have a publication called Addressing Internal Displacement, which is publicly available. But really, ICRC tries to ensure to always have a holistic approach when addressing the needs of IDPs. So again, looking not only at the needs of the people who have fled, but also the people who are at risk, and of course those of the host communities, because very often IDPs move to areas where they have friends or relatives, and an influx of people can also affect the resources and the infrastructure of the place that they have fled to. So really the idea is to provide a holistic and comprehensive response for everyone. We also look very much at the different phases of the displacement, which I just highlighted in the previous slide. And we really focus on trying to prevent displacement by reducing some of the causes, but also helping communities to prepare for it. So there's two aspects of that. One of them is that we speak to states and different parties to the conflict to remind them of their obligation to not forcibly displace persons. And also we see that over time, if the rules of war are respected in the sense that civilians are not directly targeted, this often reduces the need for people to flee in the first place. So we do have these ongoing discussions, and at the same time we discuss directly with the communities as well, especially those that are prone to displacement. We see in certain contexts such as Congo, but also in the Philippines, where people are forced to flee for very short amount of times because their villages are attacked. They have to leave to seek safety and stay out of their habitual place of residence for maybe a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then they return. And then the conflict comes back, and then again they have to displace and again have to return. So for people who are in these types of situations, we often have discussions with them to see how they can better prepare. One of the again, the small video that we saw from Svetlana is one for people who are traveling long distances, but for people who flee to nearby villages, it's also to make sure that people speak to themselves and maybe agree, especially to avoid family separation, for parents and children to agree in which village to meet up in, or indeed remembering phone numbers so that if they are separated, they do find a way to reconnect quite quickly. Again, we look at ways to mitigate the consequences of displacement for IDPs and host communities, and this is then usually done through various assistance programs. And once people have moved, we do work towards resuming or supporting them to resume a stable life, and again becomes self-reliant and self-sustainable. Next slide, please. How we respond? Sorry. So we do have a comprehensive multi-sectoral response, which means that we we address the situation of displacement both through what we call protection and as well through economic security, water and sanitation, health, legal, etc. We do try to see sort of again a holistic approach to the needs of internally displaced persons. Much like with refugees and migration, but I think this applies to ICRC generally, we do implement a lot of the programs with and through national societies who are key in a lot of the places that we operate. We try to also work towards supporting people outside of camps where feasible, because as we're seeing and as was mentioned earlier, the numbers of displaced persons are and is increasing, and we're also definitely seeing a trend of people moving from rural areas towards urban areas as well, and so there is also a need to focus more on people who move to these big urban centers and what this represents. And as I was mentioning before, two complementary lines of actions that we have are engaging with the authorities on their responsibility to prevent forced displacement, but also to protect and assist IDPs under their jurisdiction, and to directly assisting IDPs and host communities to meet both the short-term and the long-term needs that they may face. Next slide, please. So also to talk a little bit about the COVID response. Again, here we have two publications that are available. And I think it's important to highlight that while the pandemic is a global challenge, there are certain groups of people who are particularly vulnerable, both to the disease and to the secondary impacts. And the movement, you'll see the first publication is a joint ICRC and IFRC publication. The movement is committed to ensuring that they are not left out of public prevention and response activities. Internally displaced persons are amongst, they're not the only ones, but they're certainly amongst those that are particularly affected by the pandemic, owing to the circumstances in which they find themselves. And again, looking at the secondary impact, mostly economic, but also psychosocial, etc. We're seeing that this is a group of people that definitely need special attention and specific support. And so again, the two publications, one is more general on the needs of IDPs, while the other one looks specifically at camp settings, because many IDPs do find themselves in camps, as do still quite a lot of refugees. Both of the publications do have specific recommendations, which I won't go through in now for an issue of time, but again, you can find them online and where they're quite well explained. In terms of ICRC's response, if we can go to the next slide, please. Some of the actions that we've taken, and notably in the Philippines and Myanmar, is supporting health facilities with, again, the personal protective equipment, with medical and non-medical equipment, hand washing points, setup of screening, isolation, and quarantine sites, and again, this is often done in places and health centers which are accessed both by IDPs and by the host population. Supported, I see there's a typo, supported masks production projects. There's quite a few projects like that have been supported, whereby masks were produced by IDPs and therefore distributed to either the rest of the camp or the community, and again, widely available for everyone. And another important point that we focused on was community awareness sessions and risk communication, so that people are aware of what the risks are and, of course, how to protect themselves and others. And most of this, again, most of these activities are done in collaboration with the national societies, and in many of the cases with the national authorities as well. I think we've come to the end of this sort of very brief overview. So I'll stop now. Thank you very much for your attention, and we'll be around to answer the questions later. Thank you.
You still on mute.
sorry. Okay, thank you for the information. It was very, very rich of information that perhaps we may haven't heard before. And I would like to invite our participants to type your question in the chat box below, and also in the live chat if you are attending the YouTube channel. Now we would like to continue to the next speaker. So, ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Mr. Gading Gumilang Putra. He currently works with Jesuit Refugee Service Indonesia as National Information and Advocacy Officer. Mr. Gading has been accompanying and serving refugees as well as advocating for refugees' rights with the GRS Indonesia since 2014 in Bogor, Jakarta, and Yogyakarta. Mr. Gading graduated from Faculty of Law, Gajah Mada University in Yogyakarta, majoring in international law. And he was trained as lawyer and was part of GRS legal assistance before embarking on a greater role in advocacy. Mr. Gading also conducted research on the legality of detaining process for refugees in Indonesia from international law perspective, 2013, and the Syrian refugee situation from the perspective of law and politics, published in 2012. And in this webinar, Mr. Gading will discuss about displacement from the perspective of humanitarian organization, reflecting GRS Indonesia experience in accompanying refugees in Indonesia and beyond, particularly in Asia context. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, a virtual round of applause for Mr. Gading Gumilang Putra, National Information and Advocacy Officer of Jesuit Refugee Service Indonesia. So, over to you, Mr. Gading.
Thank you so much, Father Bismoko. Would you be able to hear my voice?
Yes, clearly.
Okay, thank you so much. The Dean of Faculty of Theology, Universitas Sanata Dharma, Father Bagus Laksana, the Head of ICRC Regional Delegation to Indonesia and East Timor, Mr. Alexander Faith, and the ICRC Regional Coordinator for Humanitarian Affairs, Dominic Earnshaw, as well as the fellow speakers and participants. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the opportunity given to GRS Indonesia this afternoon to share this very important topics on displacement and humanitarian from GRS experience to share with all of us today. So I will share my screen for a moment. Okay. Okay. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Just a moment. Right. So I'll be start explaining or share the experience or the materials today from the optics of GRS accompaniment and service, as well as the advocacies in the past 40 years, and also from the humanitarians optics as well. And this month and year actually marks the 40th anniversary of GRS. And I'm sorry, just a moment. I need to hide the video for there we go. There we go. In a sense that this is a sad truth that the work of the Jesuit and GRS for those who are forcibly displaced is still highly necessary at this point, like after 40 years. It was actually 40 years ago when Father Pedro Arupe, the Superior General of the Jesuit, launched this initiative. It was started right in the center of our topic of discussion today, which is in Asia, or particularly in the Southeast Asia, to be exact. And I'm to be honest, not really sure if Father Arupe imagined at that time that the number of refugees and the forcibly displaced people would actually grow steadily over the following decades, which is 40 years later. I will share a video right after this, but I would also like to limit the material that I shared today within GRS Indonesia and its services. Some might relate it with the context in Asia, but the expertise of GRS are mainly usually within the country of its operation. And I can refer to the appropriate channel if there is any particular information that is needed, for instance, in the context of the Asia with appropriate GRS operation. So I would share a video, a short video, before I continue my my presentation.
There are some places that threaten distance or financial. One is the refugee situation. Children are developing circumstances which are often unimaginable to us. In the beginning, the refugee service was down to company service, advocating for refugees worldwide. We offer food, shelter, clothing, but above all, education. This is the Jesuit Refugee Service. It's great, charismatic, loving, Father Pedro Arupe. Pedro Arupe spent most of his active Jesuit life in Asia.
A group of Jesuits who were teaching in Hiroshima witnessed and survived the explosion.
The bomb strategy took the Jesuit officers immediately to the streets of Hiroshima to care for the victims. And to Southeast Asia and saw what was happening to the Vietnamese boat people. This was after the Vietnam War. There was great internal division that Vietnamese was party from the North. They were fleeing persecution. He was horrified. He decided that the Society of Jesus had to respond in some way. So he immediately back to Rome began to write to the provincials around the world to ask them to support and serve these people.
The world needs are people completely devoted, unselfish, working for the others. We have a tremendous responsibility to adapt our spirituality to the real need of the age.
The mission grew in response to the humanitarian crisis, which unfortunately kept growing and has grown to unparalleled today. We began in Southeast Asia, soon extending to southern India. We were then in North Africa, the Middle East, Central America. We have a reputation for going where there is need. Father Arupe founded the Jesuit Refugee Service. There were estimated 6 million refugees and 4 to 5 million internally displaced people. They are now 80 million. What we hope to do is not just to help be with people in building their lives. After 40 years, we are now working in over 56 different countries and serving 800,000 refugees. They are our brothers and sisters. God, who is love and what's created us to be loving together. You can't be a believer without caring for justice. Home is where we all begin, and what we want all to.
Right, so that was an initial video on how JRS was started by Father Pedro Arupe, and when it started in 1980, the number of displaced people, as Father Donovan mentioned, was around 6 million refugees and 4 or 5 million IDPs. 40 years later, at the end of 2009, the number of refugees under UNHCR mandate increased to 26 million refugees from 6, and 45 million IDPs from 4 until 5 million IDPs back in 40 years ago. And that figure excluding the Palestinian refugees under UNRW, a mandate asylum seeker, and the Venezuelan displaced abroad, which makes the figure became 80 million people currently, and the 79.5 was recorded by the end of 2009, so 2019. So I think as the head of the delegation of ICRC earlier delivered on the speech, that the number has been increasing fastly at the moment. And as I think earlier mentioned already by the previous speaker about the IDPs and the refugees, the JRS mandate for protection is actually goes to de facto refugees, which is not only limited to the refugees based under the international law or the 1951 convention, but also goes beyond, which includes the asylum seekers and as well as the IDPs while they are still within the countries of origin. And that actually still goes beyond for those forcibly or involuntarily have to leave the country of origins or their home because of other reasons. As earlier being discussed, that the reason of migration currently have becoming more and more complex. However, I will share a little bit about the international protection and the national protection nexus. So the state has exclusive jurisdiction over its territory and citizen, and state also has its duty and rights to protect its citizen. So when there is a conflict or when there is a natural disaster and people forced to flee, but they're still within the border of the country, then they would be considered or called as internally displaced person. And this is a factual condition as earlier mentioned. But states sometimes is unable or unwilling to protect its own citizen, and when that happens, that's where the international protection sort of activated. The international community, UNHCR, and or other state will provide international protection as temporary substitute of the national protection, and the IDPs as well as the refugees are both mandates that JRS Indonesia to serve, to accompany as well as to advocate, and the following presentation will be discussing about a little bit of our experience from the ground in providing accompaniment service and advocacy for the refugees and asylum seekers as well as the IDPs. And I will start with the IDPs because initially JRS was started in 1980, and JRS Indonesia back then was not yet established formally. However, there are some Jesuit actually were present in during that response on the event of both people. But later on in the 1999 was the first one that JRS actually responded the IDPs, and Indonesia has both IDPs experience in the social or natural disaster context. The social disaster is the terms usually often used by the coordination among the governments in Indonesia. So, or simply it could be mentioned as a conflict. So the humanitarian services of JRS Indonesia stated back in 1999 till 2002 when we provide education, health, livelihood, repatriation, and integration in West Timor. as well as Aceh and North Sumatra, and it's a little bit of both of conflict and natural disaster IDPs, relief, integration, and as well as the Molucas in 2000 and 2006, 2011 and 2013, through education, income generating activity, emergency relief, peace building, and durable solution. And also Yogyakarta in 2006 and 2009 during the earthquake and the eruption of Merapi Mountain. And the last one was in Palu for psychosocial response during the last natural disaster. And so what principles do we apply on that? And this is, we adopted as well from ICRC, actually, GRS, the humanity, neutrality, impartiality, independence, and we actually put a little bit emphasis on do no harm principles. I can go a little bit detail on this, but understanding the time that I'll probably skip the next one. But I would like to emphasize on several things on this. The first one is, although the GRS Indonesia or GRS in general is a faith-based organization, the concept of impartiality is actually still being upheld in regards to that there is no discrimination on the people that we serve, as well as the diversity of the staff, as well as the volunteers who've been working with GRS. So as the video earlier mentioned, that we try to walk with refugees rather than just simply to help them. And most of the time, they are the frontliners of GRS services on the ground. They help as a volunteers and they assist sometimes as an officer as well in the context of IDPs. And the diversity of the response of the staff, of the volunteers, as well as the participation of the refugees is quite essential in GRS work. And how do we conduct that work is through several aspects, which is confidentiality, sensitivity, meaning that we really need to be mindful on the questions that we ask. For instance, not asking the same questions all the times, especially if it related to trauma and past traumas and violence. And we also focus on the strengthen local capacities. We do use still a vulnerable criteria in providing direct services mainly, but I think this is also interesting discussion. The GRS also, or at least in Indonesia, try also to open the discourse of the right-based approach where the structural change could also be explored. Understanding the local context is also one of the key component in how we conduct humanitarian work. And for that reason, I would only explain limited to Indonesia and as well as its relation with the Asia, rather than I will be speaking specifically about specific context in the other operation. And last but not least would be professionalism, and this includes accountability, transparency, how people could make complaint of our service, and so on and so forth. This would probably some of the photos that we could take a look on our response on the ground. On the left would be our support for children in Palu for psychosocial support, where GRS work collaboratively with the local school in Palu in Sulawesi. And there was a temporary house that GRS built along with the local population there, where we actually together built a house during the earthquake, and there was a Merapi response. And I think there was a photo of Father Adrianus Suyadi, I think now is with the Jesuit Conference of Asia-Pacific, who used to be the director of GRS Indonesia, which some of you might be familiar with. So now I will be moving on to the refugees, which is a lot more relevant with the current response and context of our works today. I would just highlight a little bit about the definition, but before that, I would just highlight why do people leave their home involuntarily. I think it was discussed before. but at least from the context that we face on the ground, that most of the people who came to our services or encounter with us were affected or left because of war, ethnic or religious conflict, human rights abuse, political-based persecution, natural disaster. Some other reason definitely were there, and this is in line with the definition of the 1951, or actually might be beyond the 1951 itself. So as a result, and just would like to flesh the definition a little bit, as a result of events occurring before 1 January 1951, and this is, I think, what the 1967 protocol took out, which is the restriction of the time, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reason of race, religion, nationality, membership of particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence as such result of such event, is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to return to it. So this is the refugee definition of the 1951 convention, and I wouldn't go to the convention itself, because what the practices that we've seen, at least in Indonesia, one of the best practices that despite of the non-signatory of the 1951 convention, there are a lot of best practices conducted by the government of Indonesia. For instance, creating its own definition through its own legislation, for instance, or policy. This is the highlight of the number of refugees and asylum seekers in Indonesia. There are 13,870%, which 55% of them from Afghanistan, followed by Somalia, Myanmar, Iraq, Sudan, Sri Lanka, Yemen, and Palestine. And this is the data from UNHCR Indonesia. And this is where the location of the people registered with UNHCR in Indonesia. So if you take a look, there are quite a lot of cities where the refugees resides, which mainly in Jakarta and surrounding areas. And I think earlier was being mentioned about how refugees live in the urban setting currently, and this is the setting that I think the majority of the refugee population in Indonesia live, except probably Aceh, as being mentioned earlier by ICRC, where I think they were also that the ICRC also responded there in Aceh, and I think we are in a collaboration under the cluster in Aceh as well to respond that. So in the past there was detention, but currently the detention is no longer or being restored to its original use, which is not to detain refugees and asylum seekers anymore. And how do they live? Around 8,000 of them live under the IOM community housing, which is an urban setting, and 383 in Lok Semawe under the temporary shelter, and 5,000 live independently. And this is the focus of JRS Indonesia, where those who live independently, meaning not under IOM community housing, not necessarily that they could actually afford to live. Only those, the most vulnerable ones, receive the assistance from NGO, and that includes JRS and other UNHCR implementing partners. And the process in Indonesia could be could take a long time, and started by the registration, waiting, and they would have or undergo what it's called this RSD interview. And right now, I think the RSD interview has been pushed back as well, considering the very limited option for durable solutions. So then they would have to wait and receiving the result of the interview, waiting, and then try to get or access the durable solution, which is not much. Either they could voluntarily repatriate if the country of origin is getting safer or better, local integration if the host country would provide a proper or legal avenue to do so, which is not much, or resettlement, which is the number is below, probably currently under 0.5% globally. So the waiting time has taken quite long, 5-7 years. I think globally there are millions who live in the protracted situation for more than 10 years. And how do they live in Indonesia? And this might also be relevant in some part of the country in the Asia or Asia-Pacific. Limited or no access to work. Meanwhile, they actually live very long time in a host country, and the implication would be access to medical service, housing, food would be limited. And we can see the example of refugees sleep on the sidewalk and hoping to be detained, for instance, like a refugee. I think this is only the context happening in Indonesia, where people sleep in front of the detention center hoping to be detained so that they could access for food. Self-surrender, serious health concerns were not handled due to unable to pay medical bills. Access to education is not unlimited, dependency towards assistance because they live for quite a long time, and limited empowerment activities, so some relying on family support abroad or Indonesian friend or charity or NGOs. Unclear waiting time, take years in limbo, limited designated shelter for any host country who actually put it on policy, or if the NGO provided it, usually very limited. Then limited access to other public services, legal aid, for instance. Then negative stigma, I think earlier was being mentioned as well, and limited policy or framework. And this is different. This happens differently according to different contexts. So what do we actually? What are our services, and how do we actually respond that? The first one, we provide accompaniment. That's to begin with. None of our services can be conducted without accompaniment. So accompaniment would means that we conduct home visit, we actually conduct active listening, try to be friend with refugees. We understand that cannot be in their shoes, but what we actually, the least we could do is walk alongside with them. And in regards to that, we provide also, or we conduct several direct services. Bogor and Jakarta quite similar. We provide financial assistance or cash-based assistance, and this is for the intention to buy food and housing, access to medical services, livelihood or empowerment, information and protection, psychosocial or informal classes, and last but not least, once the direct services has been conducted, in the same time we also conduct the advocacy. So basically, no accompaniment without service, and no advocacy without service, and no service without accompaniment. And specific situation is currently in Aceh. We provide emergency relief, as the ICRC provide the family restoration link. JRS provides food assistance until the end of December this year for the people who arrive the disembarkation in June and October this year in Aceh, as well as the advocacy assistance. So what would be the opportunities and best practices that we see on the ground? We start seeing that there is an ending of the child detention practices, or detention as a whole in Indonesia, in regards to practices, and this actually helped quite a lot in regards to the refugees' well-being, the managements of the humanitarian responses. We also see the opportunities of whole society approach, and burden sharing principle might be the term that often being used, but I would probably call it opportunity sharing principles. And we've been privileged to see it on the local, national, and regional basis as well on that, and that not only being conducted by the NGOs, but also the government, private sectors, alongside with the NGO and even refugees themselves. So, for instance, in the local level, while there is a limitation of the government, then the coordination, and mostly this is ad hoc, could be conducted to collaborate with each other. Understanding that the security perspective has often being used as probably that's the only comprehensive mechanism that we do have at the moment. but often the humanitarian perspective needs to be raised, and it can be avoided. So when that happens, the coordination is usually being taken on. The Global Compact on Migration was being mentioned before, and GRS would also like to see that the Global Compact on Refugees could also be seen as opportunities, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. One other thing that we see as the opportunities and best practices are the national and local policies and values. That also some of the opportunities and best practices. We can take a look at how local people, for instance, in Bogor, when they actually work together with GRS and the refugees have like a one-day food event where they actually share food from the locals and the food from the refugees. We can see from what happened how the local people with their values save the refugees from the sea, for instance. So there are a lot of opportunities and best practices to collaborate further. And this is some of the photo of our services. This is back in our time when GRS was still in detention center. We were present in Surabaya, Manado, as well as Medan. We had also English class for refugees to refugees, meaning that the refugees, as I mentioned earlier, becoming the frontliners of the volunteers. They provide English classes to refugees in Bogor, and currently the classes also open for Bahasa Indonesia. And there is also individual information session for people who were going to go through, for instance, refugee status determination. We provide access to medical services. None of us are doctor, but what we do, we conduct the assessment and we provide them access to the hospital based on the doctor's recommendation. As part of the empowerment, we also conducted swim classes and other activities in Bogor. This is just some of the photo from the grounds. And this is more of the sort of emergency relief or humanitarian relief when we actually responded to refugees on the side road. And this is what I mentioned earlier, when people actually lined up to be asking to be detained in the side road in Jakarta, and people running out of supplies because they live for a long time without assistance. And the refugees in Aceh in 2020. And I think there was a response in Aceh back in 2009. I think this is also responding to this condition of Rakhine State, where GRS worked alongside with the National Red Cross, which is part of the movement of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. And how do we continue our journey to accompany, serve, and advocate, which is part of our mission? We started by acknowledging its context, that there are various root causes of displacement, and the convention itself might not be enough. And I think it's quite similar with the ICRC, that there are quite a lot of various factors of migration. But I think one of the limitation of our mandate, only those who are involuntarily migrate. And secondly, personal and communal traumas of violence-driven displacement have a long-term effects. We acknowledge this context. And third, we acknowledge that millions of forcibly displaced people, which is 80% of them are women and children, have been in exile for more than 10 years. So there was a really strong question mark on the word of transit. Number four, this create barriers for education, livelihood, and exert immense pressure on host communities. So we acknowledge the difficulties on the host countries, whose resources are often limited, and for that reason we put the whole society approach as one of the opportunities. And last but not least, the need of protection is urgent, as this definitely relating to limited access to rights and so on and so forth. So priorities and goal of GRS would be reconciliation, mental health and psychosocial support, education and livelihood, and last but not least would be advocacy. And in some other contexts, it can go further through direct services like the one in Indonesia. So I would like to end the presentation today by watching the last video about GRS priorities, and also marking the 40 years of GRS. There we go.
Mr. Gading, there is no sound.
Thank you very much. I would end with a quote, "Home is where we all begin and what we all want people to find," as Father Donovan mentioned in the earlier video. Over to you, Father Bismoko. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Gading, for your presentation and also lots of information that you give us this evening. And now we have some questions that I would like to read. The first question for all the speakers. In the context of current pandemic, is there a possibility for refugees, asylum seekers to be resettled in receiving countries? Is there any changing policy of transiting and receiving countries in addressing the issues of refugees, asylum seekers, and other forced international migrants? So I would like to give the opportunity first to Ms. Lana.
Thank you for the question. I don't have the data for every country, and I think every country now has different regulations for the entry. The ICRC is advocating specifically to let people, in spite of all the restrictions, especially when we are talking about particularly vulnerable cases or in case of family reunifications. Can you hear me? Because I'm not sure if it works, and my connection is not very stable. So.
Yeah, we can hear you, Svetlana.
Oh, okay. So yeah, we are asking the states to make exceptions when they don't let anybody in due to COVID restrictions, to make exceptions for humanitarian cases, especially when we are talking about family reunifications. But indeed, the resettlement is much more complicated nowadays with the COVID restrictions, I think. To give you more detailed information, I will need to check, and I can get back to the ones who are particularly interested later on.
Okay, thank you.
Over?
And how? Yeah. And how about you, Ms. Matilde? Or I would like to keep the. Oh yes, please.
No, I was going to say I don't really have much to add to what Svetlana just mentioned now. I'm more focused on internally displaced persons. So questions related to refugees and asylum seekers, I think she's better placed to answer than myself. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. And then from the point of view of GRS, and now over to you, Mr. Gading.
Sorry, Father Bismoko, I lost you for a moment there. Would you like me to comment on the non-reforma crisis?
Oh yeah, right.
Would you like to
First, this question, in the context of the current pandemic, is there a possibility for refugees, asylum seekers to be resettled in receiving countries? And then you may move to the next question.
Right. Thank you. Well, at least from the Indonesia experience, it took time, definitely, because of the limited travels regulated by the resettling country as well as from the departing country, wherever they left. So yes, COVID-19 definitely bring impacts on the longer time for refugees to wait. That would be the information on that.
And then the next question about the principle of non-refoulement and how it is implemented.
Right. Well, in regards to, at least from our experience in GRS Indonesia, well, non-refoulement has been considered as one of the international customary law. So at least refugees wouldn't be refoulement or deported when they're actually recognized refugees, because that would be a violation against the international law. However, some of the issue that might be raised is in different contexts, definitely, or in some other context would be the legality status of the refugees itself. No, yes, the refugees would be violation to deport refugees, but what if the status is not yet a refugees? So that's where actually the discourse or the communication coordination would be needed, so that the non-refoulement principle should be respected, and it needs a lot of public awareness, a lot of coordination and capacity building, definitely on that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gading. I would like to move to the next question for all speakers, and this is quite long question, but it is interesting. This is very actual. The question is, President-elect Joe Biden is promising that his administration will increase the cap for resettling refugees in the USA to 124,000. I saw the statement as a very positive gesture comes from the leader of the country like USA. The question is whether this kind of goodwill will have significant positive impact to other third countries' policies and to the refugees in Asia. I would like to offer to Svetlana. Please, Svetlana.
Can I please first go back to the non-refoulement?
Oh, yeah, please.
Because I think it's important for students also to understand that maybe not everybody is aware of it, of the principle itself, right? So the principle of non-refoulement means that no one should be returned to a country where they would face torture, cruel, or degrading treatment. And we are not talking only about refugees. It's really no one should be returned. It means that a migrant who doesn't have a status of refugee also is protected from being returned to a country where he will face or she will face cruel and human degrading treatment. And what was particularly preoccupying during the pandemic, and probably still is, but especially at the initial stages, that many countries, and I will not name them because we work in a confidential way with all states, but many countries have started to deport actually migrants, especially the ones who were, for example, in immigration detention, as soon as they could, without actually considering who among these migrants might face risks in their countries of origin. What we do as the ICRC in the framework of our confidential dialogue with the states, we remind them of their obligations to respect the principle of non-refoulement and to assess individually the situation of individuals before they are returned to their countries. And I think this is an important point because, and that's why I was insisting on our vulnerability-based approach. We are not focusing only on the refugees, because migrants who are not recognized as refugees might also face risks if they are returned to their country. So this is about the principle of non-refoulement. About the statement by the newly elected president, I mean, it's impossible to predict, right, from our side. I wish I could say on behalf of a couple of presidents of the states that, of course, sure, now we will take more people in as well, but I mean, it's impossible to say. We just hope that with the states accepting more people for resettlement, countries would be in Asia, but not only, will be more willing to accept the refugees, knowing that they will be resettled in the future, and that there are less fears that they are stuck in the countries where they end up at the end of their journey. But it's impossible to predict how exactly it will influence other countries, especially in the context of the pandemic. But very interesting question, and very good to see that students are asking themselves this kind of question.
Yeah, thank you for your answer, Svetlana. Actually, we have some questions, and they are actually interesting, but I'm afraid that we don't have enough time to tackle all the questions. And now I would like to inform that the participants can get e-certificate of this webinar after filling out our survey. And the link to the survey, the survey form, can be found in the chat box here. Here, chat box. And also in the live chat in YouTube. And the e-certificate will be available to the participants within 3 days. So for those who need e-certificate, please don't forget to fill out the survey. Link can be found in the chat box. And there is also polling. It will be informed later. It is important for us to know your feedback. So I think now, after discussing a lot of interesting topic in this webinar, I would like to invite Mr. Dominic Earnshaw from ICRC, Regional Coordinator for Humanitarian Affairs, to give closing remarks.
Nggak tahu biasanya.
Just 1 minute, Father Bismoko.
Yeah.
Because we need to show the polling. First, before, and also just quick question about the presentation from the speakers. You need to ask the speakers whether they are happy to share their presentation or not. Because I saw in the chat box you already shared, but we need to ask them first, their permission. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Matilda has answered. This is no problem, but I haven't asked Svetlana.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's okay for you?
Yes.
That we share your presentation.
Maybe it's easier if you convert it to PDF format.
Okay.
Yeah, probably same with mine. I'll convert to PDF first, then circulate it over or send it over to Sanata Dharma colleagues.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think I will give the opportunity to Mr. Dominic Earnshaw to give some closing remarks.
Hey,
Dominic, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My internet has been playing up, so I hope you can hear me clearly. First of all, I would like to give a big thank you to the Sanata Dharma team, Father Bagus Laksana, and our wonderful moderator, Father Bismoko, and obviously to all our speakers, Garing Gumiling Putra from the JRS, and our own Svetlana and Matilde from ICRC. And of course, a big thank you as well to all our participants who stayed through and asked lots of interesting questions. I'm sorry we did not have too much time for discussions. The presentations ran on a bit long. For me, it was really fascinating to see the work of the JRS in Indonesia. I had the opportunity to meet JRS on the Thai-Myanmar border many years ago and see the fascinating work they are doing there. I mean, it's clear, I've seen in my ICRC career what a huge humanitarian issue migration is. I saw in Mindanao, in the Philippines with IDPs, in Afghanistan with IDPs, most recently in Greece with international migration. and where I really saw both the incredible resistance of people and the desperation and difficulties that people can be put under when they're forced to flee their homes, conflict, economics, natural disaster. And I fear in the future, as climate change begins to bite, we will only see more migration. And this is why it's essential for all humanitarian organizations to work together, share experience, and also coordinate on policy issues to try and make sure the legal framework works to the advantage of the humanitarian advantage of migrants. And I think what we've also seen, obviously we share experience with many humanitarian organizations, but what the ICRC has been realizing more and more over the years is what an important role faith-based organizations such as JRS play. In our work around the world, we see Islamic organizations, Christian organizations, Buddhist organizations that are really very close to the community, have excellent grassroots links, and can be often there first on the scene to assist people when there's conflict or natural disaster. So this is another reason why we were so happy to organize this activity with Sanata Dharma University and their network of Jesuit universities, and I think it will be the first of a number of actions the ICRC has with faith-based organizations across Asia. So I will conclude there. Thank you all very much again for the organizers, speakers, participants, and I wish you all a very good weekend. Bye.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Dominic. And now we are about to end this webinar, and thank you for all the participants who have participated in this webinar. And thank you also for our distinguished speakers today, Ms. Svetlana Yudina, Ms. Matilda de Ritmaten from ICRC, and also Mr. Gading Gumilang Putra from Jesuit Refugee Service in Indonesia. Thank you for sharing with us your experience, your thoughtful presentation about displacement in Asia. This is the second part of the webinar series on humanitarian affairs, brought to you by Sanata Dharma University, ICRC, and Jesuit Conference in Asia-Pacific. So we would like to invite you also to participate in the third part, which is going to be held at December the 11th, 2020 from 2 p.m. until 4 p.m. So once again, in the next webinar, it will be held at December 11 from 2 until 4 p.m. In the next webinar, we will have discussion about the topic access to education in conflict. So if you are interested, so please wait for the next information we will share to you. And so thank you for all, and have a nice afternoon, and see you in the next webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Mas Budi, thank you, Pak. Budi. That's it.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Keluar.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you in next part.
Sama-sama, terima kasih, and see you in the next webinar, everyone.
Terima kasih.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mas Yuda. Thank you tadi. Dan aku buat itu. Thank you, Wismo. Thank you, Mas Budi.